Welcome back to Criminological Theory. Continuing off of our exploration of societal ideas in relation to why crime occurs, we're going to look at social reaction and critical models of crime. One of the biggest aspects for social reaction is labeling theory. And I will be honest, as a criminologist, I think labeling theory holds a lot of merit. One of the things we've been trying to explore in the movement of decarceration and also reintegration back into society and where parole can work better and where it's failed is how well do we as human beings accept the possibility that individuals can change? And labeling theory really looks at it as basically what you see here is self fulfilling prophecy. There's a difference between labeling offenders that are extreme risk. Is it acceptable to have a sex offender registry? And there should be a sex offender registry. Is it acceptable to label individuals who have committed serial murder as serial killers? The same with mass killers or mass murderers. It's acceptable to determine that you want to have a person who's committed an act of murder, even if it's just one instance of it, if you want them to be put behind bars for the rest of their lives. It is acceptable to state that. No matter what your personal determination is as to whether there should be the capital punishment aspect or whether there should be life imprisonment with the possibility of parole, it is acceptable to say that some people who are, in some measure, bad individuals. But what about the rest of us? Should we stigmatize everyone? Because when you commit a crime in the United States, it is guaranteed that everyone pretty much is going to find out about it in some measure. If it's a crime that there can be public reporting, it's going to be reported in a news service. If it is something where you know people who work in the criminal justice system, they're going to know that you were arrested. So when we look at people who break the rules and break the law, and we live in a society where there are so many laws, it's this idea of do we need to stigmatize everyone and should we? A labeling theory argues we should limit it. We should limit it to the most serious of offenders, but to the rest of people, we should try and break the self-fulfilling prophecy. Stop encouraging negative labels on people and allow them to become something other than an ex-con or an ex-felon. It's almost argued that the terminology ex-con or ex-felon shouldn't even exist. That once you do your time and serve your sentence, and if you have to do probation or parole, you complete the terms of that probation and parole. As long as you don't reoffend, we should judge you as the human being with the way you are now. That's the basis of labeling theory, and it has concrete merit. Tannenbaum looked at it as an extension of how we as a society often dramatize this evil. I'm always interested in the fact that as a criminologist who's teaching at a major university, on the undergraduate and graduate level, on the undergraduate level, we actually have a class for students to take as an elective on serial killers. And it's because you could turn on any type of streaming service and find a documentary on a serial killer. We as a society are obsessed with it. We love to dramatize evil. Now most of us will say, I love to dramatize evil because it just shocks me. I can't believe that there are human beings out there who would do this. But Tannenbaum looked at the dramatization of evil and said, how do we look at it amongst kids? And how do we label them amongst their first offense? Because what ends up happening is once you tag a child with a negative label, it becomes a defining and identifying measure. The child starts to self internalize it. They start to believe that's the only thing that they can be. They start to identify with the negative behaviors associated with being that tag. They start separating themselves or segregating themselves from the rest of society and from positive influences. And then what ends up becoming relevant is it's so on their forefront, they're conscious or they're self conscious, that it's how they describe themselves and they emphasize it through their behaviors. We want to break that cycle. We want to turn kids away from negative aspects. So, one of the things that we can do is not tag them right away for their first offense and try to treat it more as a learning opportunity. Tannenbaum argues it might drift people away from criminal offending. Lemmer looked at it at this idea of from social control, that's that deviance in and of itself came from social control. And what it was that from the primary act of deviance, you were then caught and labeled, and then you created another act of deviance. You can see here there's a picture of Edwin Lemmer, who actually sat on the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice in the 60s. What he's basically stating is no different than the early ideas of labeling theory, which is that we are so focused on stopping people from committing crimes or engaging in behaviors that are negative that what we're doing is creating secondary forms of deviance. Or sorry, we're creating different forms of deviance, not secondary forms, different forms of deviance. So what you see there is whether it's with the primary form, the first act of deviance that you commit, versus the secondary act that occurs after being caught and labeled, we are in essence continuing a cycle. You see here, looking at the primary deviance, just a good definition, one best such example is heavy drinking. Why is it that, especially in the college environment, it's seen as socially acceptable? It's rationalized away. But then what eventually happens is you can continue the heavy drinking, become a problem drinker, and then become an alcoholic. The secondary deviance after the primary is the one where most people get the most severe reaction. And what he often argues is sometimes you can look at the primary first and stop the behavior before it even becomes secondary. Moving on from labeling theory, we do discuss Marxism in criminology. So Karl Marx looked at it as a matter of the difference between capitalism versus more of a socialistic system or Marxist system, what it eventually became. And he argued that there was a natural competition between the elites and the average people, bourgeois and the proletariat. So the average people versus the proletariat, the elite. So basically, when you talk about mode of production, that because the workers became the defining economy of a society, there was obviously a difference between who controls the means and who is controlled. And the ruling class would control the rest of it. So he looked at the law of capitalistic societies and said, because they're talking about preserving private property, it creates a ruling class, it already creates a legal inequality. And basically, if you're all able to own property in of itself, it kind of satisfies you, pacifies you, and you don't realize that you're actually being oppressed. So building out from Marx, Fongier looked at it and said, okay, we know that we have these issues of wealth. It might not be just as simple as what Carl is talking about here, like subjugation, but we know that there is a distribution of crime, and it does occur from how wealth is distributed. And the economic system will create disadvantages, the propensity to commit crime. So obviously, he wanted to see the shift from more of a competitive form to a capitalism that is basically owned by everybody else, right? There's some like power sharing. Richard Quinney looked at the same foundation of American society, and he had some of the same critiques that Marx did. And he said that basically there was a capitalist ruling class and the state works to serve that. So then the law is an instrument of oppression. And whether you believe in Marxist theory or not, and I know that's very controversial in the modern day, but it is a form of obviously criminology. There is a true debate going on in American society about who is writing our laws and how is our order being established. Right now, the current debate in 2024 is related around the average age of individuals who are elected to office, because it has gotten older and older and older. And it's not that the people may not be qualified to do it or able to do it on the basis of their age. It's a matter of, do they have a connection to the rest of us? Well, because we cannot ignore the fact in criminology that laws are written by politicians, and then, like we saw in the first discussion where we talked about the difference between mala in se and mala prohibita, the difference between what is considered naturally evil laws that most of us would say, yes, those are crimes, these are evil things, and then prohibited mostly because, again, most of us would argue that it's a bad crime, but it's just a crime because we made it a crime. It does matter who represents us. So Quinney was saying it's the same thing. You don't have to necessarily agree with Marxist ideas about capitalism versus, socialism or even Marxism, but there is some clear connection between who rules and who doesn't. He also stated that obviously there can be problems within the legal system, including because these institutions are run by elites, that the legal system can be used as a means of oppression. We have seen this debate in American society around things such as the access to plea bargaining and who is offered a plea and what type of plea is being offered, or even things related around the discussions of modern policing. So yes, he did discuss socialist principles, but like I said, you don't have to agree with that. Conflict theorists also look at it as this idea of how cultures set out norms and values. And what they find is, and this is part of the subcultural theories, that basically minority groups within the mainstream will break off and create a conflict. And then in essence, the dominant group will always be fighting from the cultural group, what we call border culture conflict. Salin, who was the Swedish American sociologist who created this, said that basically that this is this idea here of conflict in subcultural theory. And then it was expanded upon by George Bold, which said that these groups are shared because we need them. We have shared needs, values, and interests, and we're competing with each other. And then from these groups, there's inevitably going to be a conflict, and arising from that conflict is crime. People are going to lash out when they don't feel like they're being listened to by the political process, or when they are feeling oppressed, when they feel like the laws are unjust. They're possibly going to engage in crime. We have seen this in American society throughout different generations through means of peaceful protest and even violent and criminal protest. So it shouldn't be a surprise, according to Vold, that there's connection to crime. So the policy implications are pretty uniform in measure. You see here, it's the main Ds, as we call them: diversion, decriminalization, and deinstitutionalization. We are considered to be in the modern era of these theories. We are heavily moving people into specialized court systems where there's drug courts, there's mental health courts, there's veterans courts, to try and get people away from basically what's considered an automated system where it runs like an assembly belt, into specialized courts that can determine, do you need to be tried the same way as everyone else? We're also moving people into, with the deinstitutionalization aspect, moving people away from first line offenses of incarceration to treatment facilities for drug addiction, to not trying offenders for certain offenses if they don't meet a dollar amount, for example. And it's mostly been tricky. And we're doing the same thing with decriminalization. We have decriminalized drugs in some measure, for example, and we're moving toward, we decriminalize gambling in many states. And it's a question of, is it actually working? To the point that you see here with BOLD, what it builds into is this idea of different types of crime. This does connect with the policy implications. That's the reason why I flip-flop things this time, which is when you look at these Ds, right? These 3Ds, what we're seeing with the 4 types of crime is they have connections to what we decide to do with diversion and decriminalization and deinstitutionalization, who is clashing amongst each other. I hope that this helped with trying to understand the chapter, and I thank you for your time.